a leader. Clearly that's going to be a violation of the First Amendment. But the fact is that you've got other constitutional rights out there that, even though the First Amendment is numbered first, it doesn't trump all of the others. So in real life, what you end up with is conflicts between very real imperatives and like freedom of speech and other very real imperatives, like, for instance, national security or the right of a defendant to a fair trial. And the way our government approaches it, and it's just as elegant, really, as the institutions of free speech and free press themselves, is that there's a balancing test applied. And it gets very complex, but I'll give you an example. Dan told you a little story about how we stumbled is probably the wrong verb, but how we were able to obtain some internal defense documents that were really, really damning for the defense of Timothy McVeigh, who was the person who was accused, ultimately convicted, and executed for the Oklahoma City bombing, which, if you, I doubt any of you fail to know what that is, but it was the largest terrorist attack in the United States, killed nearly 200 people, and it was a big deal, to say the least. And here we had, it was basically a copy of a statement that he'd given to his defense team, his defense lawyers. And this thing was never intended to get into the hands of the press, okay? And so we were faced with a little bit of a conflict in terms of, the morals of running out this essentially private information in the public media. And the great thing about our Constitution and about this this balancing of constitutional principles is that we actually had a pretty clear path and a pretty clear precedent to apply analysis in this unprecedented situation. And that is, you have the defendant's guarantee of a fair trial, which is also in the Constitution, and then you have the right to a free press. Well, the way we analyzed it, and the way that the court ultimately analyzed it, was that they would not issue what's called a prior restraint. They would not tell us we could not publish this information, and they would not punish us for publishing it. But instead, they said that it's up to the courts and the defense attorney else to find mechanisms to protect and preserve the fair trial right of this guy. So we were allowed to print stories that basically said he admitted it. And in the end, he was able to get a fair trial. And the defense was never able to succeed that we had polluted the waters or anything like that. But these issues are very, very real in the newspaper world. But free speech is clearly not something that's just the stuff of journalists and reporters and bloggers and people who want to do things in a very sort of formal speechifying type way, who want to make bold manifestos about this or that or the other thing. Free speech is a right that is separate from the free press and independent of. And so, if you have, for instance, a person who is an avowed Nazi, or an avowed racist, or an avowed hater of people, they are permitted, and the government cannot take steps other than in time, place, and manner to restrict that speech. Now, that may seem like it's kind of misguided, but in the end, this idea, which I think is very important, I'm not sure if you've heard this before in this context or not, of Free Speech Week, is that there's a notion that is perhaps not accurately attributed to the French philosopher Voltaire, who was a big guy on civil liberties. And he said, I may hate what you say, and was rumored to have said this to a preacher that he was writing to. I may hate what you say, but I will defend to death your right to say. So that's another sort of strange tenet of American free speech. When I say strange, I don't mean bad, but I mean it's unusual. If you go to almost any other country in the Western world that has big-time conventions allowing free speech, and they have made hate speech illegal, that is not going to happen in the United States. So it's a very, very important thing, because you want to be able to say without hindrance. And it's important for the functioning of our democracy that you're able to say without hindrance things that are popular, things that are unpopular, things that may cause people to hate you. And you certainly don't want the government in the business of suppressing that kind of free exchange of ideas. You think of our democracy as a cauldron of ideas, and the strongest ideas will survive that sort of boiling pot. And the way to make the final product that you pull out of the pot the strongest and the best is not to withhold ingredients, but is to put everything in. And that's kind of the functioning, as I see it, of free speech. Free press, very similar, slightly different, because free press doesn't just involve the free speech rights of the press, that is, the right of the press to say things that are unpopular, which reporters and newspapers and editorial pages and bloggers do. But it also involves the freedom to gather information and the freedom to have access to information. So that's why you see bundled together oftentimes the notions of Public Information Act, open meetings, open courtrooms, access to the legislature and to its hearings and to its documents, is because the freedom of the press involves not only the freedom to say things and to report things, but the freedom to have access within certain limits to gather information about public processes. You know, the press, there was a guy named Edmund Burke back in the 1700s in England who pointed in Parliament to the gallery of the press and called them the fourth estate. That notion is even stronger in the United States than it is in England, which is that you always hear about the legislative, the judicial, and the executive branches of government. Well, the fourth estate is the press, the media. And the press is not just an observer to the democratic process, but as the name fourth estate suggests, it's a participant. It serves a watchdog function, or it should. And to the degree that free speech and free press are interfered with, the effectiveness of that branch of government is reduced, and the effectiveness of the electoral process and the selection of elected officials and the testing of ideas in the public forum is also impeded. You guys have had, I think, without going into specifics, your share of issues here where the administration or certain leaders have sort of pushed on these issues and tried to wrestle with, well, what's the appropriate amount of free speech that students and faculty should be allowed as part of the educational process. And I think that in the end, the answers have come down where I would see them come down, which is pretty darn much. Even if people have a natural impulse to try to shut people up who they don't like, or it's doing things that they don't want to hear, or looking at things that they don't want to look at them. Fortunately, I think the corrective processes are in place that the First Amendment and free speech still are alive and well and take hold. And as a result, issues are being explored and being and then in an exercise of freedom of the press, and then being told about in an exercise of freedom of speech. So I think that the biggest risks to that kind of vigorous speech-press combination is not the influence of government trying to suppress. That still happens, but for the most part, those limits have pretty much been reached and are pretty solid. The bigger problem right now, quite honestly, is that newspapers and television stations and websites haven't figured out how to make money in the way that newspapers used to by gathering information and disclosing it. And so that in itself is having an impact on free speech and free press, because a free press sort of depends on some people owning a physical press, that is, or some means of distribution of information. And so you can't separate these kind of adverse economic factors from the other more sort of malign adverse factors that people deliberately trying to shut the press up. So your generation, and I look around and I see that most of you are in the sort of either just in or entering the workforce, you're going to be the ones that are shaping these ideas, that are coming up with new ways of making it pay for itself to gather information and to keep that sort of vigilant monitoring and telling in place. And so for those of you who might be casually interested in the actual process of gathering information, it's a really but maybe more interested in the sort of entrepreneurial side of the web and things like that. It adds a layer of sort of noble purpose to the idea of building and refining these new mechanisms for gathering information. That is, you are going to be a part of the continuum of the press and free speech being an important part of our democracy. And so it's really, really important that we find the ways that the ProPublica does, the Texas Tribunes, the nonprofits, there's any number of different things that are being tried. You know, newspapers are shutting down their print presses and going online only. I don't consider that a sign of death. I consider that a sign of desperately trying to make it work through the future. So it's easy when you're involved in the day-to-day work at the student newspaper or trying to pass your grades and everything else to lose sight of the bigger purpose and the bigger role in what you're doing. And I would encourage you to remember that, because it's kind of cool. And there's a lot of things that you can do in this world that don't have that same kind of moral infrastructure, where you're doing something for a greater purpose. And that doesn't mean you walk in every morning and, in a white toga with a garland around your head and carrying a torch. But there really is something to being able to sleep at night and to doing good. One of the toughest things for me is my personal situation made it hard for me to stay in the news business, was to find other ways that I could kind of apply myself and keep big ideas at the center of what I'm doing. I have to tell you, I haven't found anything yet. I've got this great gig working for a nonprofit that's member-owned electric utilities. It's all about ideas and important things. But it's not as important as this other stuff, the free speech and the free press. For a while, I worked in government, and I was involved in trying to make sure that things were transparent and open and people were accountable. But the net effect that I could have from inside a government entity was much less than I could as an outside observer. And now, one of the things that's kind of interesting and novel is that I'm working hard to try to institute. I actually work not for a government entity now, I work for a private business. And I'm trying to introduce, in the post-Enron age, as the biggest company of our kind in the country, I'm trying to introduce and to further some very governmental style openness, but in the business context, and to pass rules and bylaws and policies that will bring some of that same mindset that things work better when they're wide open into the business world. Again, it's a big task to try to establish this mindset and this ethic of free speech, free communications in places where it didn't exist before. It exists, it's robust. The groups like the SBJ and the Freedom of Information Foundation, there's a very, very large and significant and strong infrastructure that surrounds these ideas. And so, think big thoughts and view your day-to-day struggles as journalists or people who are trying to get information for any purpose as having a bigger import. That the free flow of information, the free ability to express yourself and to gather information is not just about getting little tasks done. It's about preserving really, and it sounds kind of overblown and grandiose, but really a big part of what makes America a great country. The fact that you can have a Fox News and an MSNBC coming at it from either side, and unlike if you were in Russia, you don't have the government yanking the license of one of those networks. So appreciate it, enjoy it, explore it. I don't really know that I have another 20 minutes of raw information to give. I could tell you war stories about any number of things. But Dan, did you have any questions for me that might kind of lead in the direction you think we need to go?
I think I'd just rather open it up to questions from the audience, Pete. I guess I would ask one question. Where do you see, people ask us all the time, where do you see the news media, mainstream media being 10 or 15 years from now?
Well, you know, one of my worries is that, who here is Navajo Code Talk? Navajo Code Talk? Well, Navajo Code Talk is a language that essentially died. It was the original Navajo language. And during World War II, the U.S. government got the last of the people who really spoke this language, and it may still survive in some small pocket, the Native Americans who spoke this language to use it for radio communications, because there was nobody in Germany or Japan who understood the native Navajo tongue, and so it was just like built-in encryption. And my worry is that the speech of journalism and kind of effective, really aggressive, smart journalism is going to become Navajo Code Talk, that it's going to become a lost language. The reason I'm concerned about this is that for years and years and years, leading up to the time when Dan and I were young reporters, not recently, but within memory, the way it worked was that the older reporters would teach the younger reporters their tricks. And gradually over time, the art of journalism was getting better. And there were other external factors, kind of a level of professionalism being introduced. Well, now, people who in 20 years ago would have retired from newspapers and would have taught their trade to youngsters coming up are leaving the business either for better paying jobs or because they make too much and they get laid off. And so there's an entire sort of break in the continuity and the mentoring that has traditionally gone on in newsrooms. And so while I'm not sure where it's going to end up going, I think that one of the things that's most important for whatever succeeds kind of the old form media that was in place was that there be some sort of mechanism to preserve just the substantive knowledge of how you practice the trick. My wife and I went to Bali for our honeymoon, and we bought a piece of fabric there. It was incredibly valuable now, only because there is no one alive anymore who knows how to do that kind of weaving. That's not what we want in terms of data-assisted reporting, investigative journalism, open records research, critical thinking. And you guys are all capable of that and probably are inclined to do it. But you're not going to be as good at it as fast if you can't walk into the newsroom and watch a real wizard who's been doing it for 20 years do it. Now, so where does this knowledge go? During the Dark Ages, you know, there was a great fear, and that it wasn't great among the general populace, but among the sort of the people who had knowledge of the classics, the Latin, the Greek, the Roman, you know, literature and teachings, that it would just be lost as people were out there fighting over food and pigs. You know, I mean, and so and this may not be entirely true, but the popular wisdom is that what happened was that the monasteries became these places where, with painful hand copying by candle and oil light, these books were preserved and kept until such time as the Renaissance came around. And there was an ability to carry those forth and to integrate them into the popular culture again. And I kind of feel like that's what's going on a little bit with what we're here today and things with the Dave Project and certainly at universities and at nonprofits, that they're sort of gathering in the classic techniques and keeping them alive until such time as the business world can recover to the point that there can be a robust economy built around these practices. It's really important that people not forget what real journalism looks like and just think that, oh, journalism, that's like, you know, Tom Cruise is divorced. That's not the thing. So that's kind of, I don't know where it's going. I'm kind of a free market guy. I kind of believe in free enterprise and that the demand for ideas will eventually result in some working model, and it may be completely detached from the old journalistic infrastructure. I keep using that word infrastructure, but you know, these institutions, the newspapers and that, and they just form out of something else. And I tend to think that that's going to happen. Now, the downside risk of my approach is that I completely overestimate the demand that's out there for smart, intelligent analysis. And then in fact, we're just devolving into a race of cretins who don't want anything that aren't going to demand, you know, high quality news and information. And that's going to be the stuff of a very small and elite clique of people. I don't tend to believe that. I'm an optimist. I think that people would rather have good information, and there are going to be ways to find it out. In the meantime, though, got to keep it alive. Got to keep on practicing the dark arts of journalism.
Okay, we have about 15 minutes worth of questions. If you would be so kind as to come down to the CDC and we'll turn the camera on the microphone. If you have a question, for them, we'll get it.
Hello.
Hi there.
Don't worry about seeing me, it doesn't matter. Can we talk about the monasteries for just a second? What should journalism programs in universities, colleges, J schools are closing down? What should we be teaching to, you know, preserve the dark arts, if you will, in a iPad, smartphone world?
You know, I have to say that I have the benefit of having gone into a subsequent career and seeing that the skills that I'm going to describe to you here are not irrelevant to other job environments. And in fact, the things that make good journalists, make good lawyers, make good business people, make good marketers, make good teachers, and as such, it's not as though I'm talking about, well, you need to learn how to thread a needle with your eyes closed standing on one foot. What I'm talking about are skills that have relevance and or can have relevance and can heighten performance in almost any walk of life. Right now, I'm teaching a data assisted reporting class at the University of Texas. And a lot of those kids don't want to be journalists, but they're seeing that being able to take large bodies of information and boil them down and to think critically about what's in them and what that data represents and means will help them, whether they're you know, working in a sales position or whether they're working in journalism. So I think that that's one of the things I would identify. Learning how to work with and not be intimidated by data and being able to relate it to the real world, not just to a spreadsheet. That's very, very important. In a bigger sense, critical thinking, which is looking at situations, being able to understand what issues are presented, what is going to make a difference in the outcome, being able to look at the various outcomes and being able to frame up sort of what the future possibilities are and wherein the threats lie. That kind of critical thinking is essential. And the reason that it's not really being cultivated in the workplace and does need to in what you and I are going to call the monasteries is because the demands of the market are such that you have to turn stories so quickly that you don't really have the time to develop expertise and specialization and to look and to learn and to understand organisms that you're covering better than what the people who are in them sometimes do, because you've seen it. So some of this stuff is irreplaceable. It's just a function of having good people dedicated for years and years and years to doing the same thing where they know it better than anybody else. But getting that idea that it's better to really know and to understand than to do something slow, careful, and smart rather than quick, dirty, and stupid. Those are the kinds of values that you want to teach. Practical skills, clearly mapping, using the suite of tools that Google gives you for mapping data, fluency in the functioning of government, understanding how the various institutions of government work, and so that you know where to look see what's going to happen next, and to understand, well, the next thing they're going to do is to file a lawsuit. Understanding the law to the degree that you can sort of anticipate and know what people's rights are and when they're going to be defending them. I know I'm being kind of big and amorphous here, but just really immersing yourself and your students in the workings of important public policy to the point where they, A, are curious about it, which may or may not be something you can teach, and B, kind of get it and are able to teach themselves. So that if they know the basic framework, they're not just starting from scratch trying to learn how to do nuclear physics, but they kind of understand, I remember the state and there's federal lawsuits, and if something like this happens to somebody, they can file a lawsuit. Maybe we should ask the question, are they going to sue? You know, those kinds of, just basic world literacy, those are things that are you may take for granted because you're doing a good job at your school of teaching them, but you should understand those are important things and that it's good you're doing those things. I see a microphone.